Hi, this is Spiro. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Newsbud's Roundtable. Today we're joined by two guests. We have Erik Moshe with us, who is a Newsbud Analyst, an author, an independent writer, and Erik has served in the U.S. Air Force from 2009 to 2013, and his writings focus on technology, weapons of war, and futurism. And he's currently studying rhetoric at George Mason University. We're also joined today by Professor Abigail hall-blanco. She's a professor, an assistant professor of economics at the University of Tampa, and she wrote an academic paper there, The Drones, the Public Interest, Public Choice, and the Expansion of Unmanned Aerial Vehicles. Now, she also co-authored a highly informative paper with her colleague Christopher Coyne on the political economy of drones. Now, Erik, I'm going to start with you. I have a question here for you. In your exclusive series for Newsbud, you have been writing and analyzing extensively on the various aspects of the drone industry. Tell us how and why you became so interested in this topic and your objective in providing these in-depth analysis.
Thank you, Spiral. So I first got into researching drones, I would say, right about when I volunteered to start writing for Boiling Frogs Post. It's such a great publication with so many distinguished voices and people who actually know how to make a difference. You have journalists, and then you have journalists who are actually involved with investigating real, I won't say culprits, but real figures with real power, and that's a very rare thing. And then you have an object like a drone, a weapon, which has such a profound effect on the world and is used by numerous nations. And all these complex ideas of war, robotics, even religion, they merge and they form this interesting paradigm where things need to be investigated, things need to be explored on numerous levels, not just what you see, but the 3D aspects of it. So I like to look at things like artificial intelligence, which I'm not really sure I understand yet, and just the same thing as economics, which I am admittedly a novice in, but I have the curiosity and the drive to actually understand it. So I take things that I don't understand, and I try to challenge myself through my journalism, and hopefully I can offer the viewers and the readers something that they can take away from, and they can think about an issue in a broader and more effective, substantial way.
Well, thank you, Erik. We're glad to have you on the Newsbud team. Now, question for Professor Abigail hall-blanco. You have been emphasizing the concept of public interest. Specifically, talk about how the interest of the drone industry, including the private government players and policymakers, they're all at odds with each other, and they're at odds with the public interest. Please expand upon this and explain to our viewers this conflict of interest in layman's terms, how these interests are at odds with each other.
So when people typically talk about the drone industry, and it's not just the drone industry, it's defense in general, people, the general public, political figures, and even a lot of academics, frankly, assume that public actors and policymakers who are involved with drones and defense policy are working within the public interest. Now, that basically means that they set aside their own incentives and instead work to fulfill some broader notion of public welfare. So they're ignoring what's good for them and instead trying to work to better off everyone, however we want to measure that welfare function, if you will. Now, this is an odd assumption to make for an economist, because one of the things I teach my principal students on literally the first day of class is that economic actors respond to incentives. We all respond to incentives. And so what my work does is to try to look and see, does this public interest assumption that tends to be the dominant narrative when talking about drones, does that public interest assumption seem to do a good job of explaining what we've seen with regard to drones and drone policy? Based on my research, that framework does not do a very good job. And so the alternative to that is what's referred to as public choice. The public choice framework, again, is a very simple economic framework, which basically says the following. Individuals, policymakers included, they respond to incentives. So you have people who are in Congress, you also have private actors, so defense contractors, and you have voters. All of these groups have something that they want, whether it's to get reelected, whether it's to have favorable policies passed that will benefit their companies, or to get particular programs or benefits or something like that. And they all have something that they can exchange to try to get those things. So Congress can make laws, private interest can contribute campaign money, or they can lobby, and voters have votes. So my work tries to look at how those different groups interact with each other to try to better explain what it is that we've seen with drones in the last, particularly post 9/11 period, but even before that.
That's very interesting, Professor. Now, the drone lobby and the mainstream media consistently claim that producing drones is the most cost-effective means of achieving U.S. security objectives. Now, how would you counter this conjecture sold to the public as fact through the marketing arm of the military-industrial complex and the U.S. media?
So there's a lot to be said there, and there are a few different reasons that drones are often claimed to be cheaper, but in fact, that's not really what we see if we look at the literature. So the most favorable reports on drones give them a slight cost advantage over the manned alternatives. However, you have this other body of literature which suggests that they are, in fact, just as or more expensive than comparable manned aircraft. There are a few different reasons for this. Drones have a higher crash rate than manned aircraft, which can be really important. So if it's cheaper, but you're seeing a variety of $1 million+ crashes, that kind of tends to eat away your savings. Another thing that we see is also looking at cost in the aggregate. So the unit, that drone that actually flies, is just one part of what's needed in order for a drone to actually operate. So once you take into account all of the ground equipment, all of the microelectrical systems, and everything that goes along with it, the costs are actually a lot higher. One example that I use frequently is a particular drone known as the Global Hawk. It was intended to cost about $20 million a unit, which would make it significantly cheaper than a lot of manned aircraft. However, what's actually happened is that it costs roughly $220 million a unit, which is obviously a lot more expensive than what was anticipated. So what you're seeing on paper and what's actually happening in reality don't quite go together.
Well, that's right. Oftentimes, everything always looks good on paper. Now, Erik, you have been absolutely bringing up the concept of perpetual wars in your series. You also mentioned the exclusive monthly DoD contract reports written by Newsbud's Christian Sorensen and published at Newsbud. Now, tell us how your series and Newsbud's monthly DoD contract reports come together and provide a more macro view on the war industry and the unending wars of the United States.
Great question. Christian Sorensen has been doing us all a great service by compiling all those things. I'm sure it's very painstaking, but it shows the numbers and the amount of U.S. dollars pouring into the U.S. war machine. Whether or not each of these funds is excessive or it's effective, it's besides the point, because if you've been on the U.S. Debt Clock website, I haven't checked it today, but sometimes I go on there just to amaze myself. But it's a very high number. So I think my series, I show some type of technology that's being developed or that's currently on the rise in the market, and these things correlate when you look at the pay stubs, when you see the contracts that are being paid for by the American public, and if it benefits us in any way other than what they tell us through military publications. They say, oh, the drones are changing the way the warfare is. Drones are minimizing casualties. They are making war more clean. I think Abigail's paper demonstrates that this is not truly the case. And my work and Christian Sorensen and numerous others, not to mention James Evenplot of Media Monarchy, I got to give a shout out to my friend over there, and James Corbett, is that there's definitely a deep layered issue when it comes to military spending and the way that it works in general.
Yeah, well put. Now, Professor, here's another false premise sold to the policymakers and the public. Drones are more effective at reducing collateral damage, minimizing civilian casualties, and reducing the potential harms of troops relative to alternative technologies. Now, is this a factual premise backed by all the available data? And if not, what would be your response?
So there are a couple of different things there. So we can take civilian casualties and we can take troops, or U.S. troops, as being separate. When doing this research, this was actually the one that I was most surprised, because given the dominant narrative, you have Eric Holder, for example, who uses the phrase surgical-like precision when talking about drones. I think the specific quote goes something along the lines of, drones can eliminate the tumor known as Al-Qaeda without destroying the surrounding tissue. And that's the dominant narrative. But what we find, however, is that this does not appear to be the case. You have a couple problems with current data. First of all, the data on casualties related to drone strikes is woefully incomplete. You don't have people who are going on the ground after strikes doing an accurate recording of who is killed and who is not killed. If you look at U.S. government documents, they will talk about the number of civilian casualties as being very small. Part of that is probably a definitional problem, because if you're a military-aged male within a strike zone, so this is between the ages of, I think, 13, 14 to in your 60s, then you're considered a military target, and so you're not counted as a civilian casualty. The best data that we have on this, there are a few different sources that are compiling this, indicate that at a minimum, drones are not nearly as precise as we think they are. Now, there is a study that we, as lay people, can't access because it's done with classified data. But researchers for the Center for Naval Analyses used a classified data set looking at drone strikes in Afghanistan for a year-long period. And based on the interview with the authors, what they found was that drone strikes were an order of magnitude more likely to result in civilian casualties than if you had a manned fighter where the pilot was given clear directives. So that's 10 times more likely to result in civilian casualties. So at best, that narrative of surgical precision when it comes to civilian casualties is blurry at best. At worst, it's wrong. When it comes to U.S. military personnel, again, you see the narrative of, we don't have boots on the ground, there's not a pilot in the cockpit, so this has to be better for U.S. military personnel. What people don't know, though, is that up until very recently, drones could not be launched from an aircraft carrier. Most of them are still not. So drones actually require more individuals to be operating closer to where the drone is going to be operating, which is usually in high conflict areas. These drones also have to be guarded when they're on the ground. Drones make really nice targets when they're not flying. So you wind up having, I guess I should say, what you wind up seeing is actually more danger to military personnel in that context. And there's also a variety of literature coming out fairly recently, which is looking at the psychological impact of drone warfare. In particular, looking at things like post-traumatic stress disorder, rates of suicide and depression among drone pilots. Because when you're a fighter pilot, you fly over, you fire, the whatever ammunition that you're carrying, and then you fly off. But if you're a drone pilot, you're watching this target sometimes for hours, days, or even longer at a time. And after you hit the target, then you are watching to see the aftermath because you're interested in the intelligence that may provide. Now, a lot of these drones are equipped with things like thermosensor cameras. And so one thing that you will hear from some drone pilots is they'll talk about seeing the targets before they're hit. Their bodies show up on the thermal cameras as being warm colors, so red, orange, yellow. But after the strike, they watch as these individuals change from warm colors to cool colors. And so they talk that might have some negative psychological impacts. So again, at best, the dominant narrative isn't quite right. And at worst, it's flat out wrong.
Well, Professor, you also bring up a very important issue, the representation of very narrow interests through money and lobbying versus representation of the public at large. Now, when it comes to policymaking and implementation, with this comes to mind the revolving door phenomena, specifically between the government agencies, in this case, the Department of Defense, and the big name representatives in the U.S. Congress and the military-industrial complex. Please tell us about your take based on your own observation and study.
So I should say, first of all, that there are my co-author, Chris Coyne, and he also writes with another individual named Thomas Duncan. They have a few different papers looking specifically at the military-industrial complex and the revolving door. So I would definitely direct people toward those papers if they're interested in this in particular. When it comes to drones, in my research, I focused mainly on the big 5 drone manufacturers. So that would be Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and General Atomics. And while the precise numbers are escaping me at the moment, you definitely have what you see in a lot of different arenas when it comes to defense contracting. So that revolving door that you speak of basically means that you have individuals who are going back and forth between the military and private contractors, or Congress and private contractors, people who basically know different sides of the game. So you have a lot of retiring generals, for example, who are retiring from the military and immediately taking positions with lobbying companies or with defense contractors with the idea that they'll be able to do things, they'll be able to write request for things, for example, and put it in the language that makes it really easy for someone who is in the military to take that and then easily submit it. So you definitely have this crossover going back and forth, and people have suggested different ways that you might be able to mitigate some of that. But at least currently, that is definitely something to consider when talking about not only drones, but any kind of defense contracting.
Now, Erik, during your interview with Professor hall-blanco, you posed the following question. What is your advice to the people who are just dipping their toes into the subject and may be overwhelmed by all the facts, figures, numbers, balance sheets? Let's hear your answer on this, Erik. Can you provide our viewers with a few more suggestions or tips on where to start and where the most reliable sources are?
Sure. Well, Abigail's website. No, I'm just kidding. You have to try to access university archives first of all. I think peer-reviewed papers are very underrated. A lot of people will simply just go into Google search and try to understand economics that way. But I think that if you search for, let's say, economics for beginners, or I left a bunch of links in the article as well that have very rudimentary techniques to understand the economics in the stock market, especially when it comes to like Lockheed Martin and how their stocks, for example, they don't change very much when it comes to the financial crisis. I think their financial engineering, as I've read, is very on point. So to understand economics, first of all, I think you have to get good at math. Obviously, I'm taking math right now in college. I'm struggling through it, but I'll get there. You just have to have the building blocks in place, or else you're going to encounter things that you don't quite understand. So I think to be humble, first of all, when you approach economics, is to approach it with a good attitude. Because if you think that you're just going to understand everything, there are Nobel Prize winners. There are people who are financial analysts for a living, and they do this, and there's not much you can know about the money game more than the pros. So I think that starting with the pros, and specifically with professors, for example, like Mrs. hall-blanco, rather, is just to start with the professors, which would be going through the peer-reviewed literature and to be humble about it.
Now, Professor, Erik Moshe posed this question to you. Do you see more awareness in the populace about the negative effects of perpetual war? Let's hear directly from you, expanding upon this. Tell us about the role of the media and academia in increasing public awareness on this. Also, tell us about the importance of social media and its role in all of this.
So I think that social media has been really important in getting a lot of things out there. And not just problems related to the U.S. or problems related to defense. The best example I can give is that my husband is actually from Venezuela. And as many people know, Venezuela is not having such a great time right now. And I'll frequently pose to him how this has gotten so bad. And his response to me is usually, well, it's always been this bad. People just haven't known about it. Now, I don't know if it's always been quite as bad as it is now, but his point is that we're so much more aware now than we were before. And I think that has a lot to do with things like social media. Now, when it comes to the impacts of perpetual war, so today is the 15-year anniversary of 9/11. What's been the impact of U.S. foreign policy post 9/11? I would argue that we're a lot less free and a lot less safe now than we were on 9/11, and that has nothing to do with the terror threat. That has everything to do with government policy. Whether or not people are aware of that, that I'm not really sure. It seems that a lot of people have a tendency to try to separate foreign policy and domestic policy. So foreign policy, what's happening over there, people seem to think that that has absolutely no bearing on what happens here. But one of the big points of my current research is looking at, we can't make that clean distinction. There is no clean break between foreign policy and domestic policy. And things that happen abroad tend to come back and tend to happen here. So things like surveillance, things like the use of drones, which were used exclusively in the war on terror, but are now being used by Border Patrol, domestic police departments are trying to use drones for a variety of different things. Those things tend to come back home. And I think that people tend to start understanding the consequences of policies when it starts to impact them directly. So people, for example, tend to like U.S. drone policy abroad, but when you ask them, would you be comfortable with your local police department using and operating drones? They get really nervous. They don't like that idea. But they don't realize that that is a direct consequence of U.S. foreign policy. But that said, especially when it comes to something like drones, you are seeing a pushback against the domestic use of drones. There was a controversy actually in my neighborhood not too long ago because we have a neighbor with a drone who wanted to fly it just to kind of keep an eye on the neighborhood. And some people really liked that idea, and some people were really uncomfortable. So I think that, and I know it's kind of a non-answer to the question, but I think to some degree, yes. But on the other hand, while we're more aware, I'm not sure that that ultimately leads to a lot of action, at least not yet. It's my hope that it will.
Thank you for that, Professor. Now, Erik, I personally enjoyed your drone series called Reapernomics. Can you tell us, give us a little sneak peek of what you're going to be working on next?
Science fiction cool is what we're going to be exploring in our next episode. If you enjoy science fiction movies, if you've seen Air Force advertisements and Army advertisements, Marine advertisements, and you've felt, wow, they really know how to get recruits to enroll in the military, enlist, then you're going to enjoy this next upcoming article very much.
Excellent. Erik, do you have any final points you'd like to make?
Yes, I do. There are many drones, there are many bases, there are Reapers, there are Predators. We won't be able to measure how much they're used in the future, but thanks to economists like Professor hall-blanco, we're going to have a chance to understand it at a much better level than we did before, and also Professor Coyne as well. I just think that this is a great research venture that she's gotten herself down that road, and I'm looking forward to seeing where that road leads and also possibly where it ends.
Well, that's great. Definitely raising awareness is key. I mean, that's one of the first steps into possibly making changes, whether it's in policy, domestic or foreign. Now, Professor hall-blanco, do you have any final points you'd like to make?
Well, first, I'd just like to say that I also appreciate other people's work on this topic, journalists especially when you're looking at something like drones. There's not a lot of academic data. There's not there's not a lot of data that I can go to the government and reasonably get, just because it requires security clearances or it's not available. So people like Erik, who are working hard on this topic, are remarkably helpful to people like me, who are trying to look at this from a variety of different angles. So have to echo him on that I'm really appreciative of the people who are doing the work. I think what I would say, particularly as it relates to drones, is that one question that I'm frequently asked is, do I think that drones are bad? Are they inherently a bad thing? And I'd like to just encourage people to know or to think that drones are not inherently good or inherently evil. The real question is how do we get the good uses that we want out of drones? So drones can be used for things like agriculture and search and rescue, and they have some really wonderful applications. But drones can also be very destructive. So we've talked about civilian casualties, we've talked about cost, but there are other things that we haven't talked about. So things like terrorism, for example. Drones don't eliminate terror targets. In fact, they likely serve as a recruiting tool and actually make Americans and others a lot less safe. So the real question is, how do we, and can we even, devise policies which will get us the good things that we want from things like drones and other technologies, and yet also devise policies that will simultaneously protect us from those kinds of things which are absolutely detrimental and threatening to our liberty.
Well, great points. I'm glad that you're both keeping your eye on this, and Professor, you're working on this daily, it sounds like. So I enjoyed our discussion here today, and I'd like to have you both back at some point in the future with some more updates, and I'm sure we'll be revisiting this topic soon, as it is one that is continuously growing in this day and age. So I'd like to thank you both, Professor hall-blanco and Erik Moshe, for joining us for Newsbud Roundtable. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and also you can check out Newsbud's Daily Picks, which is our own aggregated news on newsbud.com. Reporting for Newsbud, this is Spiro.